So should Prime Minister Modi meet Chinese President Xi Jinping next week at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization conference? That's the big question. Remember, there is still tension between the Indian and the Chinese armies in Depsang, in Demchok. There is still a border confrontation. But in Gogra-Hotsprings now, there has been a pullback as there was in Pangong. So has enough been achieved on the ground for a meaningful conversation between the two principals, or is it better for India to convey its displeasure, like the foreign minister has been doing, by ensuring that Prime Minister Modi does not meet the Chinese president, because facts on the ground are still problematic? Joining me for perspective on this broadcast, I want to welcome first Ambassador Vishnu Prakash, former spokesperson of the Ministry of External Affairs. We've got Dr. Bharat Karnad, National Security Expert at the Center for Policy Research. We've got Colonel Ajay Shukla, Leading Defense and Strategic Affairs Expert, and I have N.R. Thenjing for a perspective from Beijing. I want to go across to Bharat Karnad first. This is a big opportunity. You've got Xi Jinping traveling outside China for the first time in 3 years to Kazakhstan. There is an opportunity for Prime Minister Modi and the Chinese President to meet at Samarkand in Uzbekistan. Should the two principals meet? Should India encourage and accept such a dialogue between Modi and Xi, or should we express our displeasure and say, no, President Xi, till your forces are deployed so close to the line of actual control in contravention of border protocols, we will not meet you? Bharat Karnad, let's get started.
What Xi's travel plans are, or where he's going next, should matter to our Prime Minister and should be MEA's concern. Our concern should be with our interests and trying to make Xi understand that there has been no restoration of the status quo ante that Jaishankar has been talking about for years together, since the Galwan clashes. In fact, if anything, the Chinese have reinforced their positions on the Depsang in particular, because that's where we are then denied access that are, to be in our own territory, adjoining the Karakoram highway, which is very strategic as far as India is concerned. So where is the give on China's part? There's been no give. Well, you may say that it's, the withdrawal from the hot springs and so on was something like the exchange we had on the Kailash Heights. We gave up the heights that was captured by our strategic frontier, special frontier force units in exchange for what? For their withdrawing a few fingers on the northern shore of the Pangong Lake? This the kind of unbalanced, shall we say, deals we cut with the Chinese, which is really not impressive at all. In fact, it ends up hurting our cause. And then for us to keep saying that we want a restoration of status quo ante, when you can push the agenda by not giving Xi the easy kind of, even if it is public relations, victories by having him liaise with the Modi on the sidelines of the SCO.
Okay, so you're essentially saying, don't give Xi an easy PR victory, express your displeasure, because the foreign minister nonetheless has said 4 times over just in the past few weeks that status quo ante hasn't been restored. Vishnu Prakash, you've been in the Ministry of External Affairs. It's a tricky situation. You've got the SCO meeting. It is expected that Modi and Xi would meet. Should India accept such a meeting, or should India avoid meeting Xi?
Well, Rahul, greetings and nice to be on the show. Yes, it is a tricky call, and frankly, the answer cannot be a yes or no. There are many nuances, and I need to elucidate. If the meeting is held, the main focus will be vacation of the Chinese aggression. Along the LAC. Now, there are 3 aspects that we need to bear in mind. One is that the solution, we need to find a solution to the misadventure. 2, there is a question of the process and optics. And 3, as I see, the disengagement at Gogra and Hot Springs, and particularly the timing, is welcome, yet it's a tactical move meant to judge India's reaction, because the overall posture has not changed. Now with this, let us look at how do we find a solution. The solution can and should be found on the dialogue table. There is no two opinions about it, because the other option is conflict, which nobody wants. The problem arises because China believes in negotiating from a position of strength. And unlike democratic countries, is not averse to deployment of force to gain an edge in the dialogue. China sees emphasis on dialogue as a weakness, and we have seen the fate of the informal summits in Wuhan and Mahabalipuram. But historically, China respects power, and then Xi Jinping has a very aggressive persona. He's an ambitious person. Now, given all that, the process and the optics become very important. Frankly, we don't know what is going on behind the scenes, whether a blueprint has been agreed to. It does not look likely to me, but it could be possible. And then there is a forthcoming party congress. So given all this, I would say courtesies, yes. Courtesies would mean that if they have to shake hands in the delegates' lounge, exchange pleasantries or exchange a few sentences, that's fine.
Sure.
But the body language is very important. Particularly, neither side cannot be seen to be smiling or be chummy or, it's very important. Now, the million-dollar question is about the meeting. Who will bell the cat? Who will seek a meeting? Chinese side will not seek a meeting. And I hope India side does not seek one, because that may not help our cause. China may not take this initiative in the right spirit. But in the unlikely event that Xi Jinping has sought a meeting...
One second. Can I pause you to ask, why are you saying the Chinese won't seek a meeting? Why India shouldn't seek a meeting? I'm very clear about. Why are you saying Beijing won't seek a meeting with Prime Minister Modi?
Because that is, he is the emperor. He has that complex of being the Chinese emperor who wants to restore the Chinese century. He kind of has an imperial outlook, and a person who wants to rejuvenate, looking at the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and become a figure which is bigger than Mao. And also, given the 20th Party Congress, it is not in his personality, I think, to seek a meeting.
Okay,
and
that's interesting. That's, you've explained the diplomatic nuance involved as elucidly as you could possibly. And I want to put that question then to Colonel Ajay Shukla. From a military perspective, you've got a pullback very clearly in the Gogra-Hotsprings Patrol Point 15 area. We've previously seen Pangong being cleared. Has enough, we've seen the Galwan pullback as well. Has enough happened on the ground, do you think, for the two principals to meet?
First of all, I don't think the principals meeting is an end state that is sort of valid in itself. Whether they meet or they don't meet, it's the position on the ground that we need to be worried about at this point in time. And what we find that India has done over these successive rounds of senior military commanders talks is that we have one by one conceded all the advantages that we've had, starting from the Kailash range. Now this 1 kilometer that China has pulled back in the Hot Springs area, in Galwan we pulled back, and in Depsang and in Demchok, the two key areas where China has taken an advantage. They are deep inside Indian territory and are displaying no inclination to pull back or even talk about pulling back. So, just talking in itself doesn't do anything for India. The second thing is, it appears that Prime Minister Modi is on exactly the same wavelength as Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping says the PLA has not entered Indian territory. Prime Minister Modi has said exactly the same thing, that the PLA has not entered Indian territory. There seems to be a sort of a congruence of views between the two leaders. But that is because there has been a difficult sort of position faced by India. Depsang is a clear case where the Chinese have not pulled back and are showing no inclination of pulling back. They're not even talking about it. So I think that there's absolutely no point talking to the Chinese. We need to reinforce our borders. We need to put in troops so that we make sure that it never happens again in the manner that it has this time. And, talking to the Chinese is not going to be
Okay, Sushant Sareen, Ajay Shukla says no point talking to Xi Jinping. India is conceding whatever advantages we had, and there is no inclination of a PLA pullback in either Depsang or Demchok, and therefore Modi shouldn't meet Xi. Sushant Sareen.
So one, I think, while I agree with what Ajay said on some of the issues, but on the Depsang issue, number one, I think the intrusions took place long back. They were not the same intrusions which took place in 2020. And I think the 2020 thing has more or less been cleared, albeit not exactly to India's advantage. And I don't think the status quo ante has been restored in the way it was, in the sense that I think some of the areas where we were patrolling now become buffer areas, and we are not going to be patrolling up to those points. So which in a sense means that the LAC, in a manner of speaking, has been delineated in that particular sector. But having said that, should we meet Xi or not? Number one, if there is a proposal to meet, I don't see any harm in meeting Xi Jinping. The only thing is, I think we have to recognize China is not a Pakistan. I think we need to keep lines of communication open with the Chinese. Unlike the Pakistanis, with whom you will never really get anything out of them, and there is virtually nothing that comes to the table from the Pakistanis to India. The other aspect of this is that you have to look at the fact that the foreign ministers have been meeting regularly. I think they've had at least 3 or 4 meetings, not only in India but also outside India. So I don't see any real problem between the two principals meeting. But at the same time, I think the Indian position need to be made very, very clear. I don't see any reason why we should only be looking for a compromise all the time, because a compromise doesn't necessarily work in our favor.
So you're saying meet and express displeasure.
With the Chinese.
Let the Chinese president know that we're not happy with the way things are. Let me go across to NR Tenjin for a perspective from Beijing. Can you give us a sense of which way the winds are blowing in Beijing? Is there talk about a meeting with Prime Minister Modi? Is that part of Xi Jinping's agenda for the SCO? How are you viewing this latest disengagement at Gogra-Hotsprings?
Well, quite frankly, it's not being talked about in Beijing. The main emphasis is on the SCO and the aims of the SCO, which is prevent terrorism. There will be a meeting between Putin and Xi. But, while we're talking about goat pastures and posturing on military side, and the fact is that the world is facing an imminent recession, there are going to be developing countries who are going to be unable to feed themselves. They will not have enough energy to run their economies. There's a war going on in Europe. There's dissension in the United States. I think that you have, my colleagues, in all due respect, should have a sense of perspective. It is not, the world does not dwell on the borders of India and China. There actually have many other things to consider.
Okay, let me put that question to Colonel Ajay Shukla. One, that there are other bigger problems to consider, which is what the Chinese side is saying as well, that don't let the border hold the relationship hostage. India so far has been saying no, restoration of status quo ante is important. And then, are we back to a 2020 kind of situation, more or less? Because it is a fact that Depsang in particular and Demchok were problem areas even before the 2020 offensive or 2020 PLA maneuvers. Therefore, can the government claim that we are more or less back to where things were pre-2020, past problems remain? China isn't Pakistan, it is a global power. You have to acknowledge that what has been achieved so far by itself is significant. India matching Chinese deployment on the ground, man for man, formation for formation, and therefore that is no mean achievement by itself. And therefore now, if there is to be a dialogue, there is no harm. You can meet and express displeasure.
It's one way of looking at it, and it's obviously the way that China would choose to look upon it. For China, there is no doubt about that. We have to concede to them that they are an understudy superpower, that they want to try and behave like a superpower, but that in no way means that India, which is not exactly a non-entity itself, we're sort of pretty much a regional power ourselves, we don't have to go along with China's argument that what has happened and the world doesn't live on India's and China's border, which means that we just accept the status quo as it exists now and continue from here. Absolutely not. That is exactly the way a country does not become a superpower. And Bharat Karnad has written extensively on exactly this subject. I don't think that, India has a little bit of backpedaling to do on this entire issue. Simply from the point of view of having denied earlier that there were any incursions, it now becomes a little embarrassing and difficult to say, no, there are incursions and you're sitting in our territory and not vacating it. So let India behave like a superpower as well and sort of demand and get back the territory that it's lost. I don't think any...
Is that practical, Vishnu Prakash, this idea that Prime Minister Modi must somehow go all guns blazing into a meeting with President Xi, in a real diplomatic sense, you have to maintain cordiality. To what extent can you press your case and practically express displeasure against arguably the most powerful man in the world?
Well, you don't need the Prime Minister and the President to express displeasure to each other. That is very well known. Also, the Prime Minister and the President will not get into negotiations, will not get down to nitty-gritty. For that, the spade work needs to be done. And I did mention that whether a blueprint has been prepared, could be possible, but I do not think so. Foreign Ministers meeting, NSA's meeting is very different from the meeting of the heads of states or governments. Now the problem is, not problem, but there's a difference in style. The Chinese leaders are not given to making gestures. They will not take decisions at the spur of the moment, unlike the American system where the president will take a decision. So it is very important that, and then the face is important, the public persona is important. Therefore, correctness is important, and therefore I'm saying that if courtesies have to be extended, yes. If the meeting is sought, a meeting, yes. But it has to be a business-like meeting. And we need to keep the dialogue channels open, because the only other solution is conflict, which nobody wants. The only solution can be found by a patient dialogue, without rushing in, without trying to score brownie points. That's the way to deal with China.
Bharat Karnad, don't score brownie points, have a patient dialogue, keep the dialogue lines open, because you are ultimately not dealing with a basket case of a country, you're dealing with a global power. And therefore you have to, while you have to stand up, push back as hard as you can, but you have to accept the real political reality.
Yeah, and what's the political reality? The point, I think, is I'm astonished by the kind of defeatism I hear on this show. I mean, someone said that, there's no harm in Xi and Modi meeting. There's no harm in doing this. There's no harm in doing that. We can safely leave off talking about Depsang and the Kubrang Valley and all that. Why? Because it was done before 2020 Galwan clashes. What kind of nonsense is this? I mean, if you're serious about having a dialogue of equals with Beijing, then you cannot have this attitude wherein you say, you talk on terms that the Chinese have laid down. This has been our problem. We seem awed by the Chinese power. China is like India, for God's sake. It's a country that wants to become a great power. It's far from being one. It's like us. We have pretensions.
You know, there is this article in Foreign Affairs just this morning, NR Tenjan, which you may have read, which talks about the kind of problems behind that dark iron curtain. The fact that many of your cities are locked down, you still haven't been able to deal with the pandemic, the fact that the economy is in recession, the fact that you've got a real estate debt crisis that seems to have burst, and that President Xi Jinping might be trying to exude a greater sense of authority and imperial power than he actually enjoys.
Well, the point is...
Well, as I've said before, that you seem to be concentrating on smaller issues rather than the larger ones. I was not suggesting that Xi and Modi were going to settle the border issue. That is going to take a much longer period of time and a certain amount of trust on both sides, and that has to be built. The only way you could build trust is to have meetings and dialogue. I don't know how you build trust by threatening wars and, doing these kind of passive-aggressive things, as my former colleague was talking about. It's very simple. the world is on the precipice of global warming. India has, basically stopped exports of certain parts of their rice crop. The world is in an energy crisis, especially as it applies to natural gas. People are using more coal. That's adding to the problems that we have with global warming. And yet, the only thing that my three colleagues can talk about seems to be whether or not goat pastures in these areas are important to both countries.
Well, if the Chinese army hadn't come into what you call goat pastures, it would have been a different matter. Sushant Sareen, NR Tenjen says Indian experts and the Indian government should see the larger picture. Global recession, global warming, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, Europe running out of fuel, there's a lot that's going on, and that's much more than some passages of land where nothing much grows, Sushant Sareen.
So what makes him think that we are not looking at the larger picture? In fact, the Prime Minister has been talking about the larger picture, whether it's energy issues, whether it's global warming, a whole range of climate change. He's been talking about it all over the place. So for the Chinese people to imagine that, India is only worried about these tiny little pastures, so why are the Chinese then encroaching upon these tiny little pastures? If they are such a great power, such a middle kingdom, such a, whatever delusions they have about themselves, then maybe they can withdraw from these places. Now, the other part is that a conversation between the Chinese, the Indian and the Chinese principals does not mean that we are going to go and do Ji Hazuri out there. Now, either we can say that we can do the tutu meme that, is very often on television screens and on, newspaper columns and what have you, or you can have a conversation with them and you tell them where they get off. And I don't see what is the problem with that. Did I for a moment say that we should go out there as a supplicant and say, "Ke Mai Baap, please give us back Depsang and
Bharat
Demchok"?
disagrees with that. He's shaking his head vehemently, wanting to contest what you're saying, Sushant.
We have brought Depsang and Demchok onto the table. We have linked it up with the current standoff. And even the latest statement of the MEA says that all outstanding issues need to be settled. Now, what more do you want to do? Let's go and declare war otherwise.
What you're saying is impractical, Bharat Karnad. You can't declare war. Tell Xi Jinping where he gets off.
No, this is ridiculous. The point is not that. I think earlier the diplomat on the show just said that most of the hard work, in fact, any talking of any substantive kind on any issue is done at not even the foreign minister level, but at the level of the ambassador and the foreign secretary. Now here you are, trying to pole vault onto the stage where, at summit level, where Modi and Xi are supposed to sit down and talk what? I'm sure, I don't know how conversant Modi is with the Kubrang Valley and the actual disposition of forces and so on. And what will he say then to Xi? Assuming Xi is far more conversant simply because he's on the CNC, he's far more aware and briefed on military matters than perhaps Modi is. Then what do you do then? I mean, the point is that here you are, putting the conversation and the onus on Modi and Xi, when actually this has to be done at the military commanders level, which are dud, and at the level of the foreign minister, which again has, begotten nothing. And you want to do then have Modi meet with Xi, for Xi to then say, here it is. And by the way, they're going to arrange it so that Modi comes to Xi. You won't even have the pleasure of Xi coming over to where Modi is staying. And that's how, by the way, the imagery is always managed. And,
no, but you're assuming that Prime Minister Modi would accept that, given his attitude, his posture. He's hardly going to...
What attitude and posture? I'm sorry, what attitude and posture?
He went to Ladakh at the height of the crisis and spoke very boldly and aggressively. The fact of the matter is, unlike the salami slicing of the past, the Indian army has stood its ground. Bharat Karnad, that's a fact.
No, it's not a fact. Because you have, in image terms, you basically have conceded the ground to China and Xi. What are you talking about? I mean, whether it's not just the cosmetics, it's the substance and the cosmetics where we are losing.
Both in substance and cosmetics, Sushant Sareen, Bharat Karnad argues Modi is conceding ground.
So, Rahul, the question is Mr. Karnad or you or me or Ajay, are we confident that there is nothing happening at the diplomatic level, that the diplomatic, officials of both countries are not in communication with each other, that something is not happening to try and make sure that some preparatory work is done, if at all there is going to be a meeting between the two principals, and maybe the agreement which has been struck just yesterday has been part of that choreography. How are we assuming that none of that has happened? Number one. Number two, please try to understand that the way the systems in India and China work, to a large extent in both countries, they can be similar, that things go from bottom up and things also come down from top down. And it is possible that maybe, and not that I'm very optimistic about it, because we've had these summits between India and China in the past and nothing really has come out of it. In fact, things have only gone from bad to worse. But it is a possibility. There is always a possibility that maybe certain instructions are given to settle certain issues. Now, I don't think that is going to happen. But why are we being so presumptuous all the time?
No, but it's happened in the past. Before crucial meetings, Vishnu Prakash, there has been a Chinese pullback. And this has happened between Modi and Xi as well. When meetings were to take place, the PLA pulls back. So the next week is actually crucial, where the Indian diplomatic corps, the army can put pressure so that China wants to communicate a sense of things being normal, that there isn't a problem. India is very clearly highlighting that there is a problem. Status quo ante hasn't been restored, and therefore use that window of opportunity to push your case diplomatically and get the PLA to pull back in more areas.
Well, they have made tactical retreats in the past, and therefore I did note that it's a welcome development, but possibility of a tactical retreat cannot be ruled out. The boundary problem cannot be resolved in this meeting, but what we have been doing is we have taken a firm stand that status quo ante needs to be restored.
But how do you define status quo ante? Now that's very tricky and complicated. One is the 2020, the summer exercises where the PLA came in, and some problems like Depsang and Demchok, predate those problems, and the fact is that they built extra fortifications there as well. Yeah. So how do you define what is status quo ante?
That is status quo ante. Anything, the situation as on the 19th of May needs to be restored. And obviously Depsang and Demchok, which precedes, because there has been a creeping encroachment by China, to expect that everything will happen, go away, will not happen. But like our colleague from Beijing is saying, that this is not a non-issue. What I would like to know is that if the roles are reversed, and if India were to talk about climate change and things like that, and take over Chinese territory or encroach Chinese territory, will our friend from Beijing react the same way?
Let Tanak Tenjan respond directly to you.
Yes, I mean, the whole point is that this is disputed area. The boundary has not been settled. That's why you have the contentious
so therefore, because there is a climate change issue, because
you can either let me speak or you can speak, but we can't do both.
The Indian army should go and take over Chinese territory. Is that?
Do you want to talk over me through the whole rest of this? I mean, come on. I mean, you're supposed to be a civilized man.
So because you're trivializing it, and therefore, for you it's not a concern because you are encroaching on Indian territory.
I'm not encroaching on anybody. I'm an independent commentator. American. Look, I mean, if you want to monopolize this and have a monologue, please do. But on one hand, one of your colleagues is doubting that your prime minister even knows what's going on in this area. You're trying to say that somehow nothing can happen that's good. All I'm saying is that it is important to have a dialogue. If you disagree with that, that's your concern.
Saying,
but I think if you would let me finish. If you would let me finish, sir, please extend the politeness I extend you. So, if you think that dialogue is wrong, that's fine. That means that there will be no progress. There cannot be trust without dialogue to begin with. So, it's entirely up to you. You can doubt your prime minister, your government, the situation, but until there is dialogue, there is no forward progress.
Rahul, I need to come in for
go on, Ambassador Prakash.
Yeah, I am not. In fact, I'm again and again saying that dialogue is the only way forward. The solution can be brought on the hammered out on the negotiating table. That is precisely my contention. But given the perfidy of China, one cannot expect to take everything at face value. It has to be a very carefully choreographed, discussed, and firmed up negotiations, which cannot be done by the leaders. And you cannot just be shaking hands and smiling when China is sitting on your border, period. That's my contention.
Okay, I want to go across to Ajay Shukla for a larger strategic sense in where this confrontation is going militarily. They've pulled back from Pangong, from Galwan, from Gogra-Hotsprings, refusing to pull back currently from Depsang and Demchok, making it seem as if that's the way it always was, which it wasn't. There's also a big CCP conference in October where President Xi Jinping hopes to get an extension, another 5-year term at least. Given the larger strategic calculus, where is this confrontation going in your view?
Rahul, good question. And to those who are advocating dialogue, I applaud their sort of calm and good nature. But the fact is that a dialogue takes place when both sides have something to concede and something to gain. India has handed over to Pakistan, to China, everything that it had to hand over, and there is now only Chinese troops sitting in Indian territory. There are no Indian troops any longer sitting in territory that China claims. So this business of dialogue, I would only say, what dialogue? What are we going to talk about? The second and more important point I want to make, Rahul, is that this incident in eastern Ladakh, where China, which began in April 2020, it has to be seen in a larger context, a regional context, where two rising powers are sort of at loggerheads with one another. China has been in dialogue with India for years, for decades now. We have talked through 21 rounds of special representatives dialogue. We have talked through joint working groups. We have talked at the sort of apex level in Mamalapuram and in Gujarat. It is time for India to hedge its bets and not rely only on talking. It needs to sort of prepare itself militarily. It needs to sort out its partnerships in the Indian Ocean region, where it can apply pressure on China the way China is applying pressure in the Himalayan. We can't deal with all these incidents as if they're just one incident taking place somewhere and we'll just talk about it and have a dialogue and sort out the problem. The India-China confrontation is well beyond that point, and we need to recognize that.
Well, make no mistake, China is India's enemy number one. Of that, there can be no doubt in anybody's mind. This is not a friend with whom you can sit and swing on a swing. That is not, that's living in La La Land. But the fact also is, it is a global power, a power with diplomatic, military, economic strength much more than yours, and therefore it's not a country that you can just treat lightly. India has to be cognizant of global reality and yet stand firm, as in many cases India has done. Given a very tricky situation, the fact that the Indian army mobilized to take the Chinese army head on is significant. Don't take that away from what the Indian army and the government has done. But as Ambassador Prakash said, it's a very nuanced, tricky situation. Don't seek a meeting. Don't necessarily be averse to the idea of a meeting if one is sought by the Chinese. And don't make it seem as if all will be changa after this, because it won't. Use the opportunity if it comes along to press your case. So we will be tracking what happens at Samarkand very, very closely. I'm glad we could get things started, shaping thought on this big question of whether Prime Minister Modi should meet President Xi at the SCO next week. This will be a big story which we will track very, very closely. For the time being, Sushant Sareen, Vishnu Prakash, Ajay Shukla, Bharat Karnad and Anar Tenjin for joining me with your varied perspectives. Thank you very much. As always, I don't tell you what to think. We leave it to you, our viewer, to decide whether or not Prime Minister Modi should indeed meet the Chinese president.